It begins not with ships, not with kings or maps or sails, but with footsteps, bare, frostbitten, fading into the snow, long before the first European imagined crossing the Atlantic. Long before there even was an Atlantic to cross, there were people moving slowly, quietly, carefully. They weren't Americans. They weren't even Indians. They were just people, humans who didn't yet know they were making history, only that they were running out of land and chasing the last herds the earth had to offer. Thousands of years ago, a massive sheet of ice covered the top of the world. Glaciers as high as skyscrapers, stretching from coast to coast. But between those glaciers, something changed. A crack opened, a narrow frozen corridor, and through that passage, they came. Across the land we now call Barinia, a vast plain that once connected Siberia to Alaska, they stepped onto the American continent for the very first time. Not all at once, not in a single migration, but slowly, over generations, through snowstorms and starvation and silence. This was the first America. And it didn't begin in 1492. It began over 20,000 years ago. Their names are lost. We don't know what they called themselves. But we know what they left behind. A spear point buried deep beneath the sands of Clovis, New Mexico. A mammoth bone shattered by human tools near Buttermilk Creek. Stone flakes shaped like knives, still sharp after 15,000 years. They were hunters, nomads, survivalists, and they came into a world that was raw, unforgiving, unclaimed, but also beautiful beyond belief. A continent untouched by man, stretching from frozen tundra to endless plains, from high desert to swampland jungles. There were no cities, no empires, no maps, only trails carved by hoof, wind, and time. These first Americans followed the animals, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, mastodons, mammoths, the last great beasts of the Ice Age. They hunted in bands. They made shelters from bone and hide. They carved their lives into stone, wood, and firelight. They were, for a time, the only humans on this side of the world. And for a time, the world was enough. Then something changed. The climate shifted. The great ice sheets began to melt. The oceans rose, and the beasts began to vanish. Mammoths, gone. Giant bison, gone. Sloths, lions, camels, gone. The age of monsters ended and took the old way of life with it. But the people remained, and they adapted. They stopped chasing herds and began planting seeds. They carved canoes instead of spears. They began to settle. By 9000 BC, human footprints can be found from Alaska to Argentina, in caves, in deserts, in lakes, in floodplains, in forests. They were everywhere. Different peoples, different languages, different worlds, all within the same continent. In places like Monteverde, Chile, archaeologists found traces of human life that predate the Clovis culture. Tents, fire pits, tools, bones, a whole village. Existing 1,000 years before people were supposed to be there, that discovery shattered everything we thought we knew, and it raised a question no one was ready to answer. Who were they? Did they come by land or by sea? Did they paddle along the Pacific coast, following kelp forests in hide-bound boats? Did they arrive even earlier, long before the glaciers had parted? No one knows, but what we do know is this. The story of the first Americans is older and deeper than anyone imagined, and it was only just beginning. As the millennia passed, the people spread farther, into the Great Plains, the Rockies, the deserts of the Southwest. They built new tools, new homes, new traditions. In the Northwest, they shaped totem poles from red cedar, carved with the spirits of eagle, bear, and whale. In the Arctic, they learned to build igloos of ice and boats of skin that could ride the icy waves. In the East, they gathered in forests so thick with maple and oak that sunlight barely reached the floor. And in the jungles of the South, they raised crops from flood-fed soil, corn, beans, squash. The Three Sisters, the agricultural core of the Americas. With food came stability. With stability came culture. With culture came memory. They began to bury their dead in sacred mounds. They painted stories on canyon walls. They told myths of sky and sea, of animals and spirits, of gods who once walked among them. They passed these stories down, not in books, but in voices, in firelight, in blood. And still, they moved. Still, they adapted. Still, they survived. But not all is known. Some sites suggest something even stranger. In Florida, underwater caves hide bones of humans from 12,000 years ago, buried intentionally with ritual in what was once dry land. In Brazil, skulls that seem more similar to modern Australians than Native Americans suggest a lost wave of migration, one that didn't come from Siberia at all. In Nevada, the mysterious Spirit Cave mummy, one of the oldest naturally preserved humans ever found in North America, was carbon dated to 10,600 years old. And DNA studies have revealed something even more startling: that the earliest American lineages, the so-called ancient Beringians, split off from their Siberian cousins over 20,000 years ago, which means the story doesn't just begin earlier than we thought. It may begin somewhere else entirely. So who were the first Americans? They were many people, from many origins, connected by spirit, divided by time. They weren't one tribe, one culture, or one journey. They were a tapestry, stitched across thousands of years, woven by need, by hunger, by survival, and by curiosity. They would one day become the builders of mounds, the farmers of the jungle, the rulers of great cities. But before any of that, they were just people, walking, watching, listening, leaving behind only footprints in a land that had never known them. A land that would come to be called America. But at the time, it was just home. By the time Europe was carving cathedrals from stone, by the time Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, by the time the Great Pyramids of Egypt had already stood for 1,000 years, there was a city in North America, so vast, so organized. It had neighborhoods, a central plaza, a protective wall, and a pyramid taller than the Statue of Liberty. And yet, today, most Americans have never heard its name, Cahokia. At its height, Cahokia was the largest city north of Mexico. It sat across the Mississippi River from what is now St. Louis, and it was home to somewhere between 15,000 to 30,000 people, possibly more. It flourished around the year 1100 AD, while London was still a muddy medieval town, and it wasn't alone. Before Cahokia, long before it even existed, there were other cities, other mounds, other mysteries, because the people of ancient North America weren't just hunters, they were builders. It began thousands of years earlier in the Louisiana bayous near a place now called Watson Brake. A society emerged that would stun archaeologists centuries later. Here, among the cypress trees and winding riverbeds, around 3,500 BC, a group of people built a ring of earthen mounds, some 20 feet tall, perfectly aligned. This was before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before metal, before wheels, before writing. No kings, no armies, no empires. And yet they built. Why? To observe the sky? To honor the dead? To meet the gods? No one knows, but one thing is certain: they were not primitive. These early mound builders spread. They followed the rivers, the arteries of the continent, and dotted the landscape with earthworks. Some were burial mounds, some were platforms, some were geometric, precise squares, spirals, circles aligned with the stars. Some were animal-shaped, enormous effigies carved directly into the earth. In Ohio, the Serpent Mound slithers across the ridgeline, over 1,300 feet long. Its open mouth swallows an egg. Its coils mark lunar alignments. Some say it's a calendar. Some say it's a warning. And it was built over 2,000 years ago. In Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Alabama, mounds rose like monuments. Some were built and abandoned. Others were maintained for centuries. Each one tells a story. But many of those stories are now silent because after European contact, whole cultures were wiped out, not just by war, but by disease, by forced removal, by silence, and the mounds stood alone. But the greatest mound of all was Monk's Mound at the heart of Cahokia. This was no burial site. It was a platform, a base, an artificial mountain of packed earth. It stood 10 stories tall, covering over 14 acres. Took decades, perhaps centuries, to complete. No metal, no machines, just hands. Millions of baskets filled with soil, one after another. At the top sat a massive wooden structure, likely the chief's temple. From there, the elite could see the entire city stretch out below, because Cahokia wasn't just a pile of dirt, it was a civilization. The city was organized on a grid. It had neighborhoods, public plazas, watchtowers, and wooden palisades for protection. It had a marketplace that traded goods from as far away as the Great Lakes, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Rockies. It had specialists, potters, weavers, priests, farmers, warriors, and it had astronomy. Just outside the city stood a wooden circle known today as Woodhenge, a massive solar calendar made of carefully placed cedar posts. It tracked the equinox, the solstice, the dance of light and shadow through the year. When the sun rose between specific posts, it signaled planting or harvest. This wasn't just superstition, it was science. But Cahokia was not without its darkness. In one excavation, archaeologists found a mass burial pit beneath a mound. Inside, the remains of more than 50 young women, all buried at once. Nearby, the skeletons of men who had been executed violently, some buried alive, some dismembered. It may have been ritual, it may have been sacrifice, it may have been power written in bone. Because for all its organization, Cahokia was ruled by a hierarchy. At the top, a spiritual chief called the Great Sun. He lived above the city, literally, on the top of Monk's Mound. His word was law. Below him, nobles, priests, artisans, warriors. At the bottom, farmers and laborers. It was a kingdom in all but name, and like many kingdoms, it didn't last. Around 1300 AD, something began to go wrong. Cahokia started to shrink. Trade routes faltered. The palisades were rebuilt, not once, but multiple times. Defenses grew stronger. The plazas emptied. Something was coming. Famine, invasion, civil war? We don't know. By 1400 AD, the city was abandoned. The once great pyramid was overgrown with weeds. The streets were silent. The empire of Earth had fallen. But Cahokia was not the only one. Dozens of mound cities fell in the same window. Kincaid, Etowah, Spiro, Moundville, gone. What happened? Some blame climate change. The Little Ice Age brought colder winters and shorter growing seasons. Others blame overpopulation. The land could no longer sustain the numbers. Still others suggest conflict, internal strife, or wars between cities. Or maybe it was all of them, a perfect storm. And when the Europeans arrived a century later, they found the cities empty and assumed there had never been anything there. But the mounds remained, silent, enigmatic, covered by trees mistaken for hills, ignored, forgotten, until they were rediscovered in the 1800s by American settlers who had no idea what they were looking at. Some even dug them up searching for treasure. Others leveled them for farmland, and the people who had built them had no voice to explain, because by then, many of their descendants had been wiped out by measles, smallpox, war, displacement. By the time the US government realized what these sites were, many had already been destroyed. Today, you can still visit Cahokia. The Monk's Mound still stands. The Woodhenge posts have been reconstructed, and a museum tells the story of a people who built a city from nothing but soil and sky. But most Americans drive past without knowing what they're seeing. No pyramids, no stone, no glory. Just a hill rising out of the Illinois earth. But for those who look closer, it becomes something else entirely. A memory. of a time before time, of a people who saw the land, not as property, but as sacred, of a city that ruled before Rome and vanished before it could be remembered. Cahokia was not a myth, it was not a legend, it was real, and it was only one of many, because across the Mississippi Valley, the mound builders had created something far larger than a city. They had built a world, and we are only beginning to understand what was lost. Cahokia was not alone. It may have been the largest city, the most dramatic, the tallest mound, but it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle, because behind every great civilization lies something invisible, not its walls, not its temples, but its connections, trade, exchange, the lifeblood flowing underneath everything, uniting tribes that never met, cultures that never spoke the same language but still knew each other, through stone, through shells, through copper, obsidian, feathers, before highways, before wagons, before even the wheel. There was a network, and it stretched across the entire continent. It's easy to imagine ancient America as a land of isolation, small, scattered tribes, each living alone in their patch of wilderness. But that story is a myth, because from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Rockies to the Atlantic, the ancient peoples of North America were constantly in motion, not as conquerors, not as explorers, but as traders. And the evidence is everywhere. In the Ohio River Valley, archaeologists have found obsidian tools, volcanic glass that could only have come from the Pacific Northwest, over 1,500 miles away. In Florida, burial mounds are filled with Great Lakes copper carved into intricate ornaments. In Arkansas, they uncovered seashells from the Gulf, mica from the Appalachians, pipestone from Minnesota, turquoise from the Southwest. These were not simple exchanges. This was commerce, and it ran on memory, on trust, on repetition. Like the beating heart of a living world. Follow the rivers, and you'll follow the road, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, the Tennessee. These were highways long before cars or railroads. People moved by dugout canoe, shaped from massive logs coasting downstream for days at a time, bringing goods, stories, marriages, and music with them. One tribe would trade stone tools for buffalo hides. Another would trade those hides for woven textiles. Those textiles would move farther south and end up buried in a mound 1,000 miles from where they began. It wasn't just trade, it was culture, ideas, techniques, beliefs. It was civilization without empire. There were no written records, no merchants keeping ledgers, no kings issuing taxes. But the system worked, because everything had value. Bear claws, colored feathers, cattail mats, salmon jerky, tobacco bundles, clay pots, some painted so finely they still shimmer today, ceremonial pipes carved in the shape of birds, turtles, panthers, and above all else, copper. From the copper-rich shores of Lake Superior, miners had been pulling metal from the ground for thousands of years, not with drills or dynamite, but with hammerstones, heated fires, and determination. They shaped it into axes, spirals, bracelets, armbands, spear points. Copper wasn't just beautiful, it was powerful. Some tribes believed it held spiritual energy, that it could heal, that it could connect this world to the next, and so it moved from the mines of Michigan to the cities of Ohio, to the rivers of Tennessee, to the mounds of Mississippi, melted, recast, worn, buried, traded again, generation after generation. And it wasn't just material goods that moved, ideas moved too. How to farm, how to build, how to track the stars. Even stories moved. From tribe to tribe, myth to myth, shifting slightly each time, like water shaping stone. A thunder god worshipped in one region appeared as a sky serpent in another. A mother spirit became a corn maiden. A tale of creation started in a cave in Arizona and ended in a swamp in Georgia. The trade routes didn't just carry goods, they carried meaning. And through them, 1,000 different peoples became part of something greater, not an empire, not a nation, but a civilized continent. And yet, this entire network existed without a single written word. No maps, no contracts, no currency. How? The answer lies in memory. These were oral cultures. They didn't write, they remembered. Trade routes were memorized as songs, distances marked by rivers, hills, or sacred trees. Ceremonies recorded not in books, but in ritual, repeated every year for 100 generations. You didn't need a receipt when everyone in your village knew the trader who passed through every summer. You didn't need money when the value of an object was understood through tradition and use. And you didn't need borders, because trade doesn't stop at borders, only politics do. This was not a golden utopia. There was theft, there was war, there were broken deals and jealousies and betrayals, but the system endured because it was based not on domination, but relationship. Between river and road, between tribe and neighbor, between ancestor and child. And then it ended, not all at once, not with a war or a collapse, but with a cough, with a sneeze, with a fever that wouldn't break. When Europeans first set foot on the coasts of the Americas, they brought more than ships and steel. They brought disease, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and within a generation, the trade routes fell silent, towns vanished, mounds stood empty. The people who had remembered the routes were gone, and with them, the map disappeared. The network died. And for centuries, no one even knew it had existed. It wasn't until modern archaeology in the 20th century that we began to piece it back together. One trade bead at a time, one obsidian flake, one buried necklace. The invisible web slowly reappeared, stretching across the continent like a ghost, and in its outline, we saw something extraordinary, an entire civilization, connected not by conquest, but by trust, not by flags, but by rivers, not by kings, but by memory. Today, we don't think of ancient America as connected. We imagine small villages, isolated tribes, simple lives, but that was never the truth. The truth is this: long before Columbus, North America was alive. It moved, it traded, it spoke in 1,000 languages. It passed goods from hand to hand until they became sacred. And though the roads are gone, the rivers still flow, carving the same paths they did 10,000 years ago, carrying whispers of a world we forgot. If you stand still, on a hot, windless afternoon in the red canyons of New Mexico, you can hear it. Nothing. No cars, no cities, no voices. Only the sound of dry wind scraping stone. Only the shadows of what was left behind. But if you look closer, you'll see something else. A staircase carved into a sheer cliff. A circle of stones aligned with the sun. A broken wall high on a canyon wall where no human should have reached. Here, in the deserts of the American Southwest, lie the ruins of a world few remember. A world of astronomers, engineers, artists, and visionaries. They left no written history, but they left monuments. And those monuments whisper of a civilization that rose, flourished, and then vanished. This is the story of the ancestral puebloans, sometimes called the Anasazi, a name given to them later by others, but their own descendants, the Hopi, Zuni, and others, simply call them Hisatsinom. Ancient ones. They weren't warriors, they weren't empire builders, but what they created was astonishing. From around 600 AD to 1300 AD, they built cities out of stone in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Not just huts, but apartment buildings, some with 800 rooms, some standing 4 stories tall. They carved them into cliffs, balanced them on mesas, laid them out in sacred geometry. And they did it without metal, without wheels, without pack animals, just stone, patience, and a vision of something greater. The heart of their world was Chaco Canyon, a wide, sun-baked valley in what is now New Mexico, so dry, so desolate, that most modern people would never think to live there. And yet, between 850 and 1150 AD, Chaco Canyon became the center of a vast cultural system. At its peak, it was home to multiple great houses, massive buildings of sandstone and timber, with hundreds of rooms each. The largest, Pueblo Bonito, rose 5 stories and covered over 3 acres. Inside, living quarters, ceremonial spaces, storage rooms, and kivas, circular subterranean chambers used for ritual, storytelling, and memory. But Chaco wasn't just a city, it was a compass, because its buildings weren't random. They were aligned perfectly with the cardinal directions. The walls matched the movement of the sun and moon. Certain windows captured the solstice sun at dawn. The largest kiva, Casa Rinconada, had sightlines that marked lunar standstills, a cycle that takes 18.6 years to complete. This wasn't guesswork, this was astronomy. And Chaco wasn't isolated. Across the desert for hundreds of miles, other settlements mimicked its style. Great houses appeared in distant valleys, connected by roads, real roads, up to 30 feet wide, carved straight through the desert. Some even went over cliffs, with stone stairs cut directly into rock. What were they for? Pilgrimage, trade, ceremony? No one knows for sure. But it's clear, Chaco was the center, and people came from far and wide to be part of it. But why here? Why build a spiritual metropolis in a place with no rivers, brutal winters, and barely any rain? The answer lies underground, because despite its desolation, the land beneath Chaco is filled with pockets of water, shallow aquifers fed by ancient rains. The puebloans learned to harvest every drop. They dug wells, they built catchment basins, they directed floodwaters into fields, timed to the rare summer monsoons. And with that water, they grew corn. Corn was more than food. It was life. It was culture. It was sacred. And when the corn grew tall, the people of Chaco thrived, but not forever. By 1150 AD, something shifted. Rain stopped falling. The water dried up. Crops failed, and the great houses began to empty. Some were burned, some were carefully sealed, but all were abandoned. By 1300 AD, Chaco was silent. The people moved on to the cliffs of Mesa Verde, to the rivers of Arizona, or deeper into the mountains. They became the ancestors of the Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande pueblos. They did not die out. They transformed. But the cities they left behind stood like bones under the sun. At Mesa Verde in Colorado, they built their most iconic structures, cliff dwellings, tucked into the sides of canyons, reachable only by rope or narrow ledge. Cliff Palace, Spruce Tree House, Balcony House. These were not hidden huts. They were masterpieces, rooms stacked atop each other with chimneys, windows, plazas, and kivas. Some held 150 people, all carved by hand, one sandstone block at a time. Why the cliffs? Maybe for defense, maybe to escape drought, maybe for ritual reasons. Whatever the reason, they lived there for generations, and then, just like Chaco, they left, not wiped out, not conquered, but dispersed, following the signs, following the corn, following the stories passed down in songs and smoke. Today, their descendants still live in the Hopi Mesas, the Zuni Pueblos, the Rio Grande villages, and they still remember. They tell stories of the ancestors, how they emerged from the underworld, how they wandered until they found the right place to settle, how they watched the stars and listened to the land. To them, the ruins are not dead cities. They are sacred footprints, reminders of a journey still in motion, and they know that one day the ancestors may return. Modern archaeologists still debate what happened: climate collapse, internal strife, overuse of resources. The truth may be all of them, or something else entirely. But one thing is certain: the civilizations of the Southwest were not primitive. They were not aimless. They were not myths They were real. They built in stone. They measured the heavens. They shaped a society that lasted for centuries in one of the most hostile regions on Earth. And they did it with no kings, no slaves, no war machines, just belief, just vision, just hands. If you visit Chaco Canyon today, you'll find silence. But if you wait and listen carefully, you might hear something. A whisper in the wind, a footstep on stone, a memory, still echoing through the canyons, of a people who carved their world from dust and then walked away.
For centuries they said it was impossible, that no great civilization could have existed in the Amazon, that the soil was too poor, the jungle too dense, the people too scattered, too primitive, too simple. For centuries, we believed that lie, because we couldn't see what was buried beneath the trees. But now, we can. Because when satellites look down at the rainforest, they see straight lines, perfect circles, ancient roads, and cities that no one knew were there, covered in vines, swallowed by roots, erased by centuries of silence. This is the story of the forgotten Amazonian empires and the people who built them from nothing, then disappeared. Long before Columbus set sail, long before the Inca raised their temples in the Andes, there were cities in the Amazon, not wooden huts, cities with plazas, terraces, irrigation systems, and thousands, maybe millions too, of people. But for most of history, we saw nothing. The jungle had taken it all back, and what little we did see, we ignored. Because the Amazon, we were told, was untouched, a pristine wilderness, home only to scattered tribes, hunter-gatherers living in isolation. But that story was wrong, and it began to unravel with the dirt. In the early 20th century, farmers in Brazil began digging up something strange. Soil that was dark, rich, and fertile, in a rainforest where most soil was poor and acidic. They called it terra preta, black earth. But it wasn't natural. It was engineered, created by humans thousands of years ago by mixing charcoal, bone, ash, and organic matter into the soil. This wasn't just gardening. It was agricultural technology, designed to last, designed to feed people, lots of people. And wherever terra preta was found, so were ancient artifacts, pottery, tools, charms, and ruins. But the real breakthrough came from the sky. In the 2010s, scientists began using LiDAR, a type of laser scanning that can see through dense forest canopy. They flew planes over the Amazon, and what they saw changed everything. Geoglyphs, massive geometric shapes carved into the earth stretching for miles. Roads, straight, wide paths running through jungle, linking site to site. Platforms, artificial hills raised above flood zones. Villages, arranged in circles, surrounded by defensive ditches, connected like spokes of a wheel. In one region alone, they found over 400 settlements, all built with mathematical precision. And those were just the ones the jungle hadn't completely swallowed. Suddenly it became clear. The Amazon had once been home to a vast, complex, interconnected civilization. Or more likely, many. The first Europeans to see it hinted at the truth. In 1542, Spanish explorer Francisco de Orellana became the first European to travel the full length of the Amazon River. What he described shocked his crew. He reported huge villages, stretching for miles, elaborate gardens, canoes by the thousands, highways made of palm logs, organized governments, gold. He claimed the people were well-fed, numerous, and defended by warriors. But when others followed in his footsteps, the villages were gone. Empty jungle, silent rivers, no cities, no crowds, just forest. And so, Orellana was dismissed as a liar. His accounts were ridiculed, his stories forgotten. But now, with satellites and soil, LiDAR and legend. We know he was telling the truth. The cities were real, and something had destroyed them. That something was disease. Before most Europeans ever stepped into the jungle, their viruses did. Spread by explorers, missionaries, and traders, smallpox, influenza, measles, they spread like fire through dry grass. And they killed. Some estimate that 90% or more of the Amazonian population died within the first century of contact. Not from war, not from conquest, but from germs. Entire villages disappeared in a season. Languages died overnight. Knowledge was lost that had taken thousands of years to build. By the time colonists arrived, the jungle had already begun to reclaim the cities. The roads were vines, the plazas swamps, and the survivors, they hid, scattered into the forest, changed their ways, stopped building, stopped farming, tried to forget what had been lost. But the memory remains, in stories, in sacred sites, in the soil itself. We now know that some parts of the Amazon once held densities of people as high as medieval Europe. Some cities may have had tens of thousands of inhabitants, linked together by roads and rivers, trading pottery, feathers, fruit, and knowledge. They understood the floods. They farmed without destroying the forest. They bent the land to their needs, without breaking it. They didn't conquer the jungle. They worked with it. And that may be the greatest lesson of all. Because for centuries we called the Amazon a virgin forest, an untouched paradise. But it wasn't untouched. It was abandoned. We mistook ruin for wilderness, absence for purity. But now we know. The forest we see today was shaped by the hands of forgotten civilizations, and the myths we once dismissed might not be myths at all. El Dorado, the lost golden cities, the people of the sun. Maybe they weren't fairy tales. Maybe they were memories, faded, twisted, but real. And still, deep in the rainforest, there are places no one has scanned, sites no one has excavated, legends no one has translated, still waiting, still silent, still alive, in the roots, because the jungle doesn't forget, it just waits. We've seen the rivers, we've seen the mounds, we've seen the silent cities beneath the jungle. But what about the kingdoms? Because scattered across ancient North America, from the southern plains to the northern woodlands, there once stood powerful societies that governed, taxed, defended, and ruled, not just tribes, not just villages, but actual kingdoms, some with capital cities, some with royalty, some with armies, and one with a king so powerful his people built a capital city 3 times larger than London. You've probably never heard his name, but he ruled an empire in what is now Arkansas. The story begins not in a jungle, not in a desert, but in the wide, open floodplains of the Mississippi and Arkansas rivers. This was a land of swamps, hardwood forests, rich black soil, a land that flooded in spring, dried in summer, and grew corn like nowhere else. And in that land, the Mississippian culture thrived. Between 900 and 1600 AD, it stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. Hundreds of towns, tens of thousands of people, dozens of chiefdoms, each ruled by an elite class. But among them all, one stood above the rest. Its name was Nodina, and its king would be the first native monarch ever described in writing by Europeans. His name was never recorded, but his title, the Chief of Pachaha, a kingdom centered near what is now Osceola, Arkansas. In the 1540s, when the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto marched through the southeast, he encountered a series of powerful native kingdoms. He was expecting villages. Instead, he found cities. When his army arrived at Pachaha, they were shocked. The city was surrounded by a wooden palisade. It had temples, platform mounds, and defensive towers. Boats filled the rivers, soldiers lined the walls, and ruling over it all was the chief. De Soto's scribes described him as a figure of immense authority, commanding thousands, receiving tribute, leading wars. And he wasn't alone. Pachaha had rivals, most notably a neighboring city called Casqui. Two kingdoms in conflict. A war no one remembers. A world that was already ancient before America was even born. But Pachaha and Casqui weren't the only ones. To the east, in what is now Tennessee and Alabama, there stood Moundville, a massive city of over 30 mounds, likely ruled by a priest king, surrounded by warriors and elite nobles. To the north, Etowah in Georgia rose with 6 major mounds, ceremonial plazas, and an elite class buried in gold and shell regalia. To the south, the Caddoan Confederacy governed vast stretches of Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. Not a single kingdom, but a network of allied cities, each with its own chieftain, bound together by language, trade, and ritual. These weren't disorganized peoples. They had laws, caste systems, military alliances, and in some cases, possibly even written records, carved into wood or bark long lost to time. But as quickly as they appeared in the European record, they vanished. Not because they were weak, but because they were first. The moment Spanish explorers entered these regions, they brought with them death. Within decades of De Soto's journey, the kingdoms he visited were gone. Cities depopulated, elites disappeared, structures collapsed. The jungle, the forest, the river took them back. De Soto's own journey ended in failure. His men wandered for years, lost in a land too vast to control. He died on the banks of the Mississippi, buried in secret so the locals wouldn't know their god-king had fallen. But the stories they wrote down about Pachaha, Casqui, Moundville, Etowah would become the only trace of civilizations wiped out before anyone else even arrived. And yet, echoes remain in the legends of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek, in the artifacts pulled from mounds still standing tall in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, war clubs, copper helmets, shell masks, symbols carved into stone, spirals, hands, birds. Some believe they tell stories. Others believe they map the cosmos. Whatever their meaning, they speak of royalty, of power, of ceremony, of belief in a divine order that stretched from the stars above to the cornfields below. There is one mound that still towers above them all. Monk's Mound at Cahokia, a man-made mountain of earth 100 feet tall, covering more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. And at the top, once stood a massive temple, perhaps the palace of a ruler, perhaps a gateway to the gods. No one knows for sure, because the kingdom that built it left no records. Only soil, only bones, only ruins. But what we do know is this: Cahokia was not a fluke. Across North America, dozens of powerful societies rose, built cities, created governments, waged wars, raised kings, and then vanished. Today, we barely speak their names. American history books skip from Columbus to Jamestown, from the Pilgrims to independence. But in between, an entire continent pulsed with civilization, not in stone castles, not in marble columns, but in earthworks, shell beads, ceremonial fires. Their kingdoms were made of stories. Their crowns were woven from feathers. But their power was real. And in the end, it was that power that made them first targets. Because the first to meet the Europeans were the first to fall. And so, their kingdoms faded. Not in fire, not in glory, but in silence. Forgotten by the conquerors, dismissed by the historians, but remembered by the land. In the curves of rivers that once carried tribute, in the mounds still standing tall after 1,000 years, in the children of their children who still dance, still pray, still remember. The kingdoms are gone, but their spirit never left.